Once in a while, the remembrance of my time early on, Janet mentioned it today about Yogananda, and Yogananda was a great lover of Jesus. He wrote a 2-volume, 1,600-page books on the metaphysical interpretation of the New Testament, because they were both heart yogis. Great, great souls. Of course, my favorite has always been Jesus. I've always felt an inner disciple. And when there's a signature of the energy, I know it. And so I wanted to speak a little bit today about the energy of that, how that transforms us. And there's an old saying, as within, so without, and as above, so below. And I don't know who exactly ever came up with that, but it represents a great metaphysical truth. And Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of the Unity Movement, knew that, and he would sit in the silence for up to 6 hours a day. In the silence, and he exercised the will faculty, as he called it, was the executive power of mind. Even though he dealt with a lot of stuff in his physicality, his hip was like one leg was 2 inches smaller than the other one, and he walked with a very pronounced limp. He saw himself as a man of 6'2" with fiery red hair and an earring, and he was a very powerful being. And he utilized his will and his imagination and his faith to bring forth a whole movement. And Yogananda used to say, if you can't find a self-realizationship temple in your town, go to a unity church, because there you will find the energy, the signature of the Christ. And so today, I want to speak a little bit about that power and that use of will and that use of imagination. And when I was sitting in my own silent time, I had this remembrance of a movie, Jesus of Nazareth, that I saw initially back in 1977. And I was sitting in a room with 5 other hospital corpsmen, trainees, and I was one of them, in New London, Connecticut, and we were watching all week long this mini-series of Jesus of Nazareth, and we were just in complete silence watching it because we were in awe, because it had its own signature of the Christ energy. Franco Zeffirelli was a great director, and he produced Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, and this mini-series, and there was the signature of the Christ energy there. And I remember in the film that there was a character, Matthew, a man that portrayed Matthew. Matthew was initially, at least in the film and according to Scripture, was a publican, a man without faith. But he was a tax collector, and he was despised in his community because all he wanted was from people. He never gave anything back. And he heard a rumor of a great manifestation of spirit, a manifestation of increase, a manifestation of a catch of a great fish, a volume of fish, because they lived in a fishing village called Capernaum. He and other disciples, Peter, for instance. And this figure Jesus the Christ was at Peter's home. And there were so many people in his courtyard that there was no room for a certain event to take place, which was a man that was on a stretcher to be lowered down through the thatched roof and placed at the foot of Jesus. And in walks Matthew, and he's demanding payment because of back taxes from Peter. And Peter and Matthew were at odds with each other. They didn't like each other very much. But here was this man laid down in front of Jesus who had some type of palsy, and his body was very crippled and bound. And Jesus looks at him, and he gets up and he unbinds the cords. And Matthew and Peter are still. And they're all wondering what is going to happen next. And what happened next was a demonstration, once again, of great increase, great vision, great imagination, and great will. And that's how the unity teachings developed. Because there was these demonstrations of great power and presence and healing. And so we have this depiction of Jesus looking beyond the appearance and saying to this man, "Take up your bed and walk." And the man is speechless at first because he's always been bound within his imagination, within his vision of the limitation of being this way since birth. But then he begins to trust, and he begins to move. And he stands up, and everyone is in awe. And the vision and the quality of the consciousness of the Christ overcame the limitation of the collective within that fishing community that had always seen this man as a cripple and needing to be gotten around on a stretcher. And he gets up and he is absolutely blown away with what is happening. And everyone is in awe. And this is the possibility of this energy to move, to heal, to transform our lives in ways that we had previously held our own vision as small for our own life experience. This is the possibility that this work is all about. So, there's a possibility for each one of us here to realize, what is going on with that demonstration? Repeated demonstrations within the scripture or the telling of the story called the Bible. That for me, I've never been one just to be satisfied with that healing took place. I'm always wondering, well, how did that take place? What mechanism was it that was employed by this figure known as Jesus the Christ, who was according to the teachings, Charles Fillmore called him the God-man. And that doesn't mean that he was more or better or different than us, but he was the fulfillment of what it is that you and I are becoming. And that within God mind, there is this image of us, of you and I, that is beyond the vision and the imagination that we have for ourselves. And that we, if we claim that good, it can be demonstrated within our lives. That is the promise. That is the good news. That is what is up for us at this time. So in the 21st century that we find ourselves in, there is this movement within consciousness to kind of like, well, how did those cells react? What energies were employed? And there are so many variations of healing that people feel this kind of Christ energy to be about, as they say in Scripture, the Father's business. I feel it moving in my hands. I feel it moving in my body, and it is calling me to step into a higher order of being, and that is what I hold for you. All of us can look at our lives and see that there's a piece of us that has, as the example given in this story, a palsy of some sort, where we're just not quite functioning like we would or could or desire to. But there is also a part of us, and Charles Fillmore, in the silence of his own consciousness, got it. That these disciples, that this whole drama, this whole passion in this story was a projection of an inner experience, that we have these disciples within our own spiritual infrastructure. We have the inner Matthew, and we have the inner Peter, and we have Thomas, and we have Philip, and we have John, and we have Andrew. We have James the Less, the son of Alphaeus, and we have all of these inner disciples. Charles Fillmore called it the 12 powers of man. So how is it that we work with these disciples? Well, it's using the I am. The I am identity within us, which is the Christ identity, which is located at the top of the head. That can descend down into the inner disciples. And when Jesus said, "Follow me," he was invoking an inner process of the I am self, the Christ self, speaking to each one of these inner disciples. So it's not just an old story. This is a story and an actuality of each one of us calling our own inner disciples through visioning, through imagination, through the use of the will, and perhaps most important is the power of love. So Peter and Matthew are, in the story, at odds with each other. But then there is another part within this mini-series that I thought was so profound, and it is still profound today, because it represents truth. So Matthew, who's a publican and associates with people that are not kosher, let's just say that. Matthew says, "Well, you should come to my home sometime." And Jesus says, "Well, how about tonight? How about tonight?" And all of the other disciples say, well, you shouldn't associate with him. He is friends with all types of people that are of low repute. And he says, that's nonsense. I'm going. And so there is this part in the film where Jesus just walks in to the room, Matthew's home. Peter is standing outside. He won't come in because of the Hebrew laws of keeping oneself pure and so forth. But then there is this energy again, this Christ energy that moves. And Jesus starts to tell the story of the prodigal son. He was lost, and now he came home. Came home to the Father's house. And inch by inch, Peter gets over his mind-made idea of what is right in God. Because of the Christ energy dissolves all of that, and he comes in, and Jesus is holding Matthew by the shoulder and Peter and brings them both together as brothers. And all of that past stuff just dissolves. And there is this kinship with everybody in the room, even those that would seem to be, well, depicted in the film as prostitutes, or none of that mattered. It didn't matter. All of those made-up stories of the mind went away. And that was the beginning, really, of that whole 3-year period of tremendous earthing of eternity, grounding of eternity, of the higher world's spiritual presence into the groundedness of the earth experience. And this has been going on for 2,000 years. And humanity has interpreted this energy with all types of stories and denominations and made up rules and rituals and all that. And that's fine for the personal psyche of the adherents of that way. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But what abides, what is the backstory of this way of being? The backstory. Because Matthew was a tax collector, and Peter was a fisherman, and all the rest. That was the surface story. But what's the backstory? Is the presence of God. And that this person, this being, came into the world, and we've made up all kinds of stories about him. But he's really there as an example. Not that we should toe a certain line in order to be saved. We were never not saved. We just forgot. And divine remembrance is about looking at that example and saying, my God, that's real. Not all this other made up stuff. And I know this to be true. When I was in Encinitas, California at the Self-Realization Ship Chapel, I've shared this on another occasion here, but it's so profound for me. Maybe it'll touch you too. I was in this service, and there was a monk there, and he was doing his thing about old stories about Yogananda and everything, and that was fine. But there wasn't any real presence there. And then I got up and I went into the bookstore and I was leafing through some literature, and something in me started to move. And I started to really cry. And I said, I got to get out of here, because I felt embarrassed a little bit by being in this public place and that happening. But it was tears of joy. Something happened, something moved within this inner being. And I just walked up and down the street on 2nd Avenue. I'll never forget it. And I just wept with joy. And I remember later in that day, I went to this place called Harmony Grove, and it was a psychic community. And I sat down because it was a weekend of spiritual enjoyment and exploration. And I sat down with this lady, and she went into this deep place. She said, oh, the Master is here. The Master is here. And I said, who? And she said, Yogananda. He touched you over at the place where you were before you came here. And I didn't tell her where I was. And I said, oh my God. If that's what divine love is, I'm going for it. Nothing will stand in the way of this demonstration. So if I think back, this movie is certainly just a rendition of, but the energy was there, and that's what's important. Is the energy there for you? What is your vision? What is your quality of relationship with presence? Are your most cherished beliefs about God standing in the way of your having a direct felt knowing of Spirit, of presence in your life? That's what I'm interested in. Not that you adhere to a certain moral code or toe a certain line. It's just like, how alive are we? How much are we allowing in God? And what is this place dedicated to? In a little while, Janet mentioned a time at 12:30 to 1:30 of visioning, utilizing the imagination and the will to really define what it is that we are as a spiritual community. And I wrote down some of the language that on the 27th of May, we had a board retreat. And we talked about, where do we want to go? What wants to be born? And the words that came forth were wholeness, authentic relationships, making space for the unhealed places in each of us, space for exuberant light and the allowance of shadow, of an integrated life, for practical mysticism, for deep and broad understanding, for spiritual hospitality and helping others, just being able to come as you are and to be embraced as you are, a place of loving kindness. Those are the visioning words that we came up with. And then we decide, well, let's have this as an opportunity for the people of this center. What wants to be born in this center? How can we allow the Christ energy to move through us more and more? And there's so much diversity within this place, and it's a great thing. But there's a backstory. There is a backstory and underlying presence, and I know that Jesus, the Christ, was totally in tune with the backstory behind the drama of all what we read. He was totally in tune with a singular intention of not only healing, not only preaching, but seeing the vision of the actual self within each person and calling it forth. And that's what I keep wanting to hold, that space for this place. Holding the space for the possibility that this place is a place of tremendous birth and maturation of the divine within you. It's up to us. There's a timing to all of this. You can just walk out this door after the service and say, well, somebody else will take care of that. Or you can be part of it. It's up to you. There's no pressure. Just like this morning with name tags. Nobody has to put on a name tag. But it's all about, well, yeah, oh, that's your name. Coming just a little bit closer to being friendly, to being in fellowship, to being loving. That's the whole idea behind a name tag. Instead of, oh, hello, dear one, or hi there. And a minister years ago, Max Lafser, I think he may have been here or something, I don't know, at one point. He's a good friend of mine. And he was in the church in Walnut Creek, which is a big church, and in Kansas City. And I asked him, how do you remember everybody's name? And he says, oh, I don't bother with that. I just call everyone dear one. It worked for him. Hello, dear one. So anyway, I feel that this is important work. I feel that it's the ground of being work that is ours to allow if we choose. It's always the freedom of choice. I'm hoping that it can be a very dynamic conversation after this service, because the board and myself, I'm part of the board, we would like to hear from you, because it's about respect for you and what it is that wants to be born here at this place. It's all about the energy. It's all about the Christ energy. It's here, right now. Maybe you can feel it. It's divine intelligence and love. And it wants so much for us to be in union with it consciously. We are already part of it, and it will always be part of it. But how much are we aware of it consciously? That's the key. It's the way of the soul. It's the way of God in us. Can I get a big amen? Amen. And so it is. Thank you.